Hello, well, welcome back to the snack-sized sessions. I think this is probably the cheeky little chocolate cookie in the afternoon session. So we're going to be looking at serverless SQL pools again. We looked at them earlier with the dimensional model, but now we're going to look at using them with another service, Power BI Dataflows. Now we'll skip past this bit. I showed this bit earlier, but there's a QR code for Twitter. Now, we're going to have a look at using serverless SQL pools with Power BI Dataflows. We'll take a very quick look at what serverless SQL pools is, what Dataflows are, and why we want to use them together, and some considerations. So essentially, Dataflows is a Power BI service feature. It existed as Power Query within Power BI Desktop. And essentially, it allows you to connect to many different data sources, pull that data in, transform that data, and store the data in the service ready to be used by Power BI Desktop, for example. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got three Power BI data models that are using a single data flow. And they're really used to centralize data for use in the Power BI service. I think we've touched on what serverless SQL pools are. It is an Azure Synapse Analytics feature that allows you to write SQL statements, read and write data that's stored in a data lake. There's no data itself contained within the serverless service. But one thing to note is that it exposes a SQL endpoint that can be connected to by tools. In this example, Power BI. Now, in the Azure portal, when you create your Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, you're going to get an endpoint, a serverless SQL endpoint that you can connect to as if it was a regular database. Now, for Power Query or for Dataflows in Power BI, we're going to be loading some file data. In this example, it's Parquet, could be CSV, but we're going to expose an external table to the Power BI data flow so that Power BI can connect to, ultimately load those files in. If we've got CSV, Parquet or JSON, let's let serverless SQL do the processing, do the overhead, take that processing away from Power BI so that it can be scaled up if there's more data. Now, Power BI has got a process called query folding, which essentially, if you're transforming data within Power BI and Power BI can push the transformations back down to the data source, then it will do. So in our scenario, serverless SQL pool will accept a SQL statement. So in our data flow here, we're creating an aggregate transformation. We're grouping by to reduce the number of rows we've got. I don't need all the rows from my fact table, so I'm going to roll up to a higher level of granularity for my data flow. But as you can see, there's SQL being generated by Power BI. Ultimately, that will be pushed down to the Synapse Analytics serverless engine. So you can see here in the monitor area of Synapse Analytics, as of, I think it's probably a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, we can now see the SQL that's being run against the serverless engine itself. And you can see here the transformed SQL that Power BI has generated, and it's being run against the Synapse Analytics instance here. So if we have a little look at the data loading performance, I've got a little addendum on this slide as well. Now, I've tried this with CSV and Parquet. So as you can see, when the Power BI native data lake connector is being used to load in CSV and Parquet, it's slower because essentially Power BI is loading that data in and then transforming it in its own engine. as the data scales, Power BI is going to be buffering that data to load and transform. We can use SQL Serverless to do the heavy lifting for us. So the test was 3 files, totaling 4.5 gig. And as you can see, SQL Serverless in both Parquet and CSV was dramatically reduced in terms of the speed of processing. Now, if anyone follows Chris Webb, you know, he was the go-to person and is the go-to person for analysis services. Now works on Microsoft in the Power BI team. He did blog this week about the performance of using SQL Serverless and Power BI with untransformed data. So keep a little lookout, because he's going to be producing some more in the series, which will be good to look at. Now, if we take a look at the considerations, okay, again, cost. Okay, I always like to draw your attention to the fact that SQL Serverless, Serverless SQL Pools, okay, it costs money, and it's based on the amount of data that you're processing. Okay, it's not time, it's not amount of resource, it's the amount of data that you're processing. So again, take this into consideration. So for example, if you're building a data flow, Power BI can be quite chatty, sending SQL down to the service. You might want to use small development files to test with. And infrastructure, okay? Because essentially we're adding another service into the mix. That needs managing, everything that comes with that, security, administration. But in this respect, we're using Synapse Analytics Serverless SQL Pools as a processing engine. We don't need to use any other aspect of Synapse Analytics. So we could actually create the service and purely use it for Serverless SQL Pools to take the heavy lifting away from Power BI and give that to the Serverless SQL engine. Okay, now, for reference, there is a blog post where I go into a little bit more detail available here, and the QR code will take you directly to that blog post. So I think we've finished with a couple of minutes to spare. So any questions that I can go through?
Let me have a. There was nothing that I could see in the questions. So now is probably a good time for people to take a little bio break, because we then zoom straight into kind of Andre's presentation.
Yeah, what I will say is I've got a longer session at Data Saturdays at the end of February where I'm going to go into a lot more detail in this. We're going to break down what's happening, you know, under the hood. So yeah, look out for that one.
How do I find?
Thank you very much.
How do I find more information about this Data Saturday?
I don't know, Mark. I believe there's a URL, datasaturdays.com.
Or you could Google it with Bing.
Yes, Bing. Yeah, Google it with Bing.
Yeah.